November 3rd, 1943. A dugout near Gomel, Belarusian SSR. The stench of stale cigarettes, unwashed bandages, and human waste hung thick in the air. A familiar miasma of the Eastern Front. Outside, the Soviet artillery hammered relentlessly, an unseen, deafening metronome measuring the grinding advance of the Red Army. Inside the subterranean infirmary, a single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow light on the exhausted faces. Yelena Petrovna Volkova, a medic wearing the faded olive-drab uniform of the Red Army and the simple starched white kerchief of her profession, moved with a controlled, almost mechanical efficiency. She was 24, but the deep shadows beneath her eyes, the set of her jaw, and the way she flinched only subtly at the nearest concussion explosion suggested a lifespan measured in battles, not years. A wounded lieutenant, his chest wrapped tight in a makeshift pressure dressing, groaned and reached weakly for water. Yelena knelt beside him, the cheap metal of her canteen cool against his dry lips. "Patience, Tovarish, Lieutenant," she murmured, her voice a low, steady sound barely audible above the din. "The field surgeon will see you soon. You've held the line." He tried to smile, the effort a grimace. Held the line for a few hours. The Germans, they are pulling back, but they fight like cornered rats. Every ruined village, every stretch of forest road, a killing ground. Yelena nodded, rising slowly. The retreat of the Wehrmacht was a strange, terrifying victory. Their hospitals, supply dumps, and command posts were scattered, vulnerable. But the Germans, particularly the SS detachments, left nothing behind but scorched earth and booby traps. Their desperation was creating a security vacuum, a swirling chaos that offered opportunities as dangerous as they were vital. Her true orders, scribbled on tissue-thin rice paper and memorized weeks ago, had nothing to do with syringes or surgical thread. They came directly from the 4th Directorate of the NKVD, the Department for Sabotage and Reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Yelena Volkova was a trained nurse, but she was also Agent Nightingale. Her mission was simple in its objective, yet suicidal in its execution. Infiltrate a German medical unit attached to Army Group Center. Verify the rumored existence of a secret intelligence cache containing high-grade Soviet operational maps, and locate an embedded German counterintelligence officer codenamed Sparrow. The current front line was too chaotic. Her commander had decreed that the only way to slip deep into the fracturing German rear was to be taken. She finished cleaning a tray of rusty surgical instruments, her fingers flexing almost imperceptibly as she slid a razor-sharp scalpel into its slot. The time was now. The field surgeon, a tired major named Grigorovich, had just left to coordinate the evacuation of the most critical cases. Yelena walked to the far end of the dugout, where 3 newly captured German prisoners, 2 young infantrymen, 1 surly Fallschirmjäger, sat guarded by a single, bored private. "Private Sidorov," she said crisply. "Major Grigorovich requires a list of available morphine ampules from the supply tent. Take a moment to retrieve it." The private, grateful for a break from babysitting, saluted sloppily and hurried out. Yelena waited precisely 60 seconds. The sound of a heavy tracked vehicle, perhaps a Panzer-Jagdkommando, approaching the position was her cue. She moved like a shadow, taking a blanket, 2 loaves of field bread, and her small medical kit. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her mind was cold, focused. She stepped out of the dugout, not toward the Soviet lines, but toward the distant, terrifying sound of the German armor, toward the chaos that would swallow her. The rumble was closer now, the distinct whine of a Maybach engine. She took a deep breath, tasted the freezing, sulfurous air, and started running into the shattered forest. This is it, she thought. The final thought of the medic, the first thought of the spy. Section 2. The Capture and the Mask of Service. Yelena ran for perhaps 5 minutes, the roar of the incoming armored column growing exponentially louder until the ground itself vibrated beneath her worn boots. She burst through the tree line onto a narrow, shell-pocked road just as the lead vehicle, a grimy STKF's 251 half-track, swerved to avoid a crater. Behind it lumbered a column of supply trucks and 2 intimidating Panzer IV OSF-H tanks, their long 7.5cm KWK-40 L-48 cannons angled aggressively. The half-track slammed to a halt. 2 German infantrymen, their Stahlhelm low over their eyes, jumped out, Karabiner 98K rifles leveled instantly. "Halt! Halt, du Schwein!" one screamed, his voice raw with fatigue and adrenaline. Yelena stopped dead, dropping the small bundle of supplies and raising her hands slowly, deliberately. She made herself look terrified, wide-eyed, yet completely harmless. Her uniform, Soviet, undeniable, was torn and mud-splattered, but her medical insignia was clearly visible. "Please, don't shoot. I am a medic, a nurse," she cried out in clear but accented German. She pointed to the red cross painted crudely on the side of her helmet and her medical kit lying in the dirt. A tall, hard-faced officer, a lieutenant of the Heer with the Knight's Cross ribbon partially hidden by his collar, emerged from the half-track. He assessed the scene in a split second. A young woman, a Soviet medic, clearly disoriented and alone, running straight into their lines. An escaped prisoner, perhaps? A deserter? "Search her," the lieutenant barked in German. "If she's armed, shoot her." The soldiers moved quickly, rough hands patting her down. They found nothing but the field bread and the scalpel in her kit. The lieutenant walked toward her, the sound of his leather boots crunching gravel and ice. He stopped inches away, forcing her to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "You speak German well, Russenmädel," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Why are you here? Why run toward our guns?" Yelena took a shallow, shaky breath, allowing a genuine note of desperation to color her voice. "Our position, it was overrun, completely destroyed. I was the only one left who could walk. I heard your engines. I hoped, if I surrendered, I could be used. I am a trained nurse. I only want to tend the wounded. You're wounded. I know the Geneva Convention, Lieutenant. I can be useful." The officer, whose name was Lieutenant Klaus Richter, eyed her skeptically. The German casualty rates in the Gomel sector were astronomical. Every medic, even a captured Soviet one, was technically a resource. He glanced back at the column, at a large, heavy-duty truck marked with a red cross, designated for field hospital support. "Take her," Richter ordered the soldiers, gesturing toward the truck. "Inform Major Dr. Hess. She is a prisoner, but a resource. If she steps 1 foot out of line, shoot her. Understood? Get moving. We need to reach the withdrawal point before the Ivan tanks cut the road." Yelena was shoved unceremoniously into the back of the transport. Inside, the noise of the engine was deafening, amplified by the heavy canvas cover. She sank onto a wooden bench next to several stacks of crates marked Verbands material, dressing material. She had achieved the first, easiest step, capture and assimilation into a retreating German unit. Now came the impossible part. She had to locate the intelligence cache, identify Sparrow, who was known only to be a senior German counterintelligence operative embedded deep within the local command structure, and transmit the information, all while maintaining the role of a terrified, apolitical battlefield nurse. She opened her kit and pulled out the small, thin piece of Soviet field bread she had wrapped in cloth. Hidden in the center of the loaf, baked into the dough itself, was a small, tightly rolled cigarette paper. On it, written in invisible ink that would only appear when briefly exposed to iodine vapor, easily obtainable in a hospital setting, were the final, crucial coordinates for the intelligence cache. A seemingly arbitrary set of map references pointing to a destroyed Orthodox monastery 20 kilometers to the west. She carefully broke the bread in half, extracted the paper, and concealed it beneath the sole insert of her boot. She had minutes to commit the coordinates to memory before destroying the evidence. The truck jolted violently over another mine crater, throwing her forward. Section 3. The surgical scrimmage and the first sighting. The journey was a protracted nightmare of stops, starts, and the distant, constant rumble of battle. 2 hours later, under the cover of a freezing, spitting rain, the German column reached a temporary field dressing station. Not a hospital, but a collection of tents and armored ambulances hastily set up in the courtyard of a shattered brick factory. This was a Hauptverbandplatz, a main clearing station, a chaotic, temporary harbor before the final retreat. Yelena was immediately hauled out and marched toward the largest tent. Inside, the scene was horrifying. Major Dr. Karl Hess, a man whose face was pale and drawn from lack of sleep, was performing a rapid triage under the glaring acetylene lamps. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the smell of ether. "Major Hess, I have a Soviet prisoner, a nurse. Claims she can assist," Lieutenant Richter announced over the screams of a soldier whose leg was being amputated without proper anesthetic. Dr. Hess didn't look up, his scalpel moving with sickening speed. "Good. Put her to work. If she hesitates, Herr Leutnant, use her as a blood bank. We are short of everything." Richter gave Yelena a cold stare and shoved her toward a station where orderlies were struggling to control a hemorrhaging corporal. "You heard the Major. Serve the Reich," he hissed, before marching away. Yelena plunged immediately into the grim reality of her new role. The mask of fear she had maintained for Richter dissolved, replaced by the detached focus of a professional. She grabbed sterile gauze, scissors, and a bottle of iodine, the very chemical she needed. "Clear the airway," she snapped at the young orderly struggling with the corporal, switching easily to technical German. She assessed the wound, a deep shrapnel tear in the thigh. She moved faster than the exhausted German orderlies, her hands precise, stemming the flow, expertly applying a tourniquet high on the limb. Her competence was undeniable, silencing any immediate skepticism. For the next 3 hours, she worked without a break, a Soviet medic saving German lives, navigating the ethical tightrope of her mission. While dressing a minor head wound, Yelena casually picked up a swab, dipped it heavily in iodine, and passed it quickly, almost invisibly, over the back of her hand, where the map coordinates were currently pressed against the paper-thin insole of her boot. She had to memorize them tonight. It was during a brief lull, as orderlies dragged a stretcher bearing a freshly dressed casualty toward the waiting ambulance column, that she saw him. A man was standing outside the command truck, not in uniform but wearing the expensive, clean, gray leather coat of a civilian contractor or a political functionary. His face was sharp, intelligent, and unsettlingly calm amidst the bedlam. He wasn't giving orders, nor was he tending to the wounded. He was simply watching, observing the flow of traffic, the interaction between the officers, and, most disturbingly, every movement of Major Hess and Lieutenant Richter. Yelena immediately identified him as out of place. He carried himself with the authority of someone who commanded the officers, but lacked the grime of frontline service. This man carried no visible weapon, yet possessed an undeniable danger. As he turned slightly, she caught the briefest glimpse of a small silver pin affixed discreetly to his lapel. A tiny, stylized hawk, or perhaps a sparrow. Her breath hitched. Could this be Sparrow? A high-ranking counterintelligence agent observing the retreat, verifying who was loyal and who was fleeing? It was too soon to be certain. But the identification of a key asset or operative was paramount to her mission's success. She committed the man's precise height, build, and facial features to memory, continuing to bandage her patient as if nothing had happened. The discovery jolted her into realizing the immediacy of her next steps. She had the coordinates, and perhaps the operative. Now, she needed to transmit the information and secure the maps. The Hauptverbandplatz would be struck down and moved within the next few hours. She needed access to the command structure's communications and, more importantly, a physical means of signaling. Her gaze drifted past the man in the leather coat toward a large, high-powered Fumo 51 Mammoth radar tower, one of the retreating technological assets the Germans were trying to save. It was currently disabled, mounted on a heavy trailer, but the antenna stood like a skeleton against the gray sky. If she could reach that antenna, previous section text. Her gaze drifted past the man in the leather coat toward a large, high-powered Fumo 51 Mammoth radar tower, one of the retreating technological assets the Germans were trying to save. It was currently disabled, mounted on a heavy trailer, but the antenna stood like a skeleton against the gray sky. If she could reach that antenna. Section 4. The map. Coordinates and the radar signal. The Hauptverbandplatz was breaking down. Major Hess, looking like a ghost, ordered all mobile surgical equipment loaded onto the Opel Blitz trucks. Yelena, covered in blood and sweat, was indispensable. Her proficiency had earned her a measure of trust, or at least utility, that kept the suspicious eyes of Lieutenant Richter slightly distracted. As the camp prepared to move, the logistics became critical. Yelena approached a young, overwhelmed German radio operator struggling with a heavy Tornister Funkenlage field radio unit. "Private," she said sharply, pointing to the wires. "This cable is frayed. You will lose contact if you don't secure it before transit. I need sterile water to clean these instruments. My hands are needed on the transport, but I must sanitize this kit." The private, desperate for competence, pointed to a small dark shed nearby. "Water pump is there, Schwester. Be quick. We move in 10 minutes. This was the chance. The shed contained the emergency water supply and, more importantly, was out of the direct sight of the officers. Yelena sprinted the short distance. She secured the door from the inside with a rusty bolt. She pulled out the cigarette paper from her boot, retrieved a swab from her kit, and dipped it in the medical-grade iodine solution she had pocketed. She lightly brushed the swab across the paper. Slowly, faintly, the invisible ink reacted, revealing the precise figures. 54.21N, 31.04E, the coordinates of the ruined monastery. She stared, memorizing the sequence, the numbers burning into her mind like acid. She quickly chewed and swallowed the paper, washing it down with a gulp of the stale water. The evidence was gone. Now, the transmission. Her training dictated a simple, prearranged distress signal. 3 short pauses on the standard German military frequency, mimicking atmospheric interference, followed by a specific, slight shift in the wavelength. The number of seconds elapsed during the shift would encode the coordinates. 2 seconds for 2, 1 second for 1, and so on. She knew the risks. The Fumo 51 Mammoth radar, though primarily for air surveillance, possessed a powerful, high-gain antenna. If she could briefly reroute a temporary power source to the antenna and manipulate its focusing mechanism, she could broadcast a momentary, powerful electromagnetic pulse that would register as a distinct artificial spike on the Soviet tactical radio receivers. A signal far more robust and less susceptible to jamming than a standard radio transmission. It was reckless, but guaranteed to reach the designated NKVD listening post far behind the lines. She exited the shed and walked purposefully toward the disabled radar trailer. A heavy-set sergeant, Gunther, was supervising the securing of the massive antenna array. "Sergeant, Major Hess requires the antenna power unit checked," Yelena stated, her voice authoritative despite her uniform. "He wants to know if the emergency auxiliary battery will hold charge during the move. We need to be able to contact the forward artillery observation post if we are ambushed." A spurious medical excuse tied to communication security. A perfect blend of fear and urgency. Sergeant Gunther, exhausted and clearly wanting the tower secured, simply grunted. "The power unit is secured in the back compartment. Don't touch anything else, Schwester." Yelena climbed onto the trailer's platform. The auxiliary power unit was running. She deftly found the large, braided cable leading to the antenna focusing motor. Using a pair of heavy surgical clamps she had kept hidden in her tunic, she quickly stripped back a section of the insulation. She then used a piece of aluminum foil from a discarded ration wrapper, insulating it with a strip of rubber from her boot heel, to create a temporary, high-resistance short circuit across the control switch for the antenna focus. She closed the switch. For a terrifying, silent fraction of a second, the antenna focusing motor whined, drawing maximum current. Then, following her internal count, she opened the circuit, paused for 5 seconds, closed it, paused for 4 seconds, and repeated the sequence for the entire coordinate string. 5 to 4, 2, 1, 3, 1, 0, 4. A series of controlled surges, each one a sharp spike of electromagnetic interference, invisible, silent to the ear, but screaming on a radio receiver hundreds of kilometers away. She quickly reversed the damage, her heart hammering. The antenna looked normal. The sergeant was none the wiser. The coordinates for the cache were now halfway back to Moscow. Now, she needed to find out the location of Sparrow, and more urgently, discover the unit's final destination. The Germans were withdrawing. But to where? Section 5. The command tent and the operative's name. The German unit was a composite force, medical staff, remnants of an armored support detachment, and a contingent of the Feldgendarmerie, military police, tasked with maintaining order during the frantic withdrawal. As dusk deepened, bringing with it a biting cold, Major Hess gathered the remaining medical personnel for a quick, whispered briefing. Yelena stood among the German nurses and orderlies, her Soviet uniform now covered by a bulky, borrowed German fatigue jacket, blending in physically, if not ethnically. Hess revealed their destination, a railhead near Mogilev, where the unit would be loaded onto a military train and redeployed further west, out of the immediate line of fire. Mogilev was deep in German-held territory, exactly where the operational maps would be most valuable. The intelligence cache was 20 kilometers in the opposite direction. Yelena had only hours to find Sparrow, confirm his connection to the cache, and break away. She needed to confirm the identity of the man in the leather coat. Accessing the command structure was her only option. A small single-room tent served as the temporary headquarters. Lieutenant Richter and another officer, a supply captain named Schiller, were inside, poring over maps by the light of a flickering petrol lamp. Yelena walked directly to the tent flap, affecting an air of bureaucratic exhaustion. She addressed Captain Schiller, the least suspicious of the two, because he was focused on logistics. "Captain, Major Hess needs immediate confirmation on the availability of tetanus impstoff and blood plasma units for the trip to Mogilev. I must verify the count before the next transport leaves," or we will lose the wounded." Schiller, annoyed by the interruption, but recognizing the medical urgency, gestured impatiently toward a clipboard hanging on the central tent pole. "It's on the supply manifest, Schwester. Read it yourself. Don't waste my time." Yelena quickly grabbed the clipboard. The manifest was exactly what she pretended to be looking for. But pinned beneath it, secured with a German push pin, was a single, official communication slip, a message far more interesting than plasma counts. It was a Fernschreiben, telex message, marked Confidential. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Her eyes scanned the German text, moving rapidly. It was an instruction concerning security personnel for the Mogilev move. The crucial lines were clear. Priority transport of personnel, Dr. Lothar Brandt, RSHAA 4E4. Ensure compliance with his specific intelligence requirements regarding forward command documentation and the security of materials during transit. His operational security code is Sperling, Sparrow. Dr. Lothar Brandt, RSHA, Reich Security Main Office, Section 4E4, Foreign Intelligence and Counter-Espionage. The civilian coat, the detached authority, the hawk pin, it all fit. He wasn't a military officer. He was high-level Gestapo intelligence, verifying the security and loyalty of the retreating military assets. She memorized the name and the unit designation. She glanced outside the tent. Sparrow was still standing near the CDKFZ 251, speaking quietly with Lieutenant Richter. He was the key. He would likely be privy to the final, most secure storage location of the forward command documents, the maps. Yelena carefully replaced the slip and the clipboard, checking that the pin was exactly where she found it. She exited the tent and walked toward the command vehicle. She had to get close to Brandt to hear a name, a time, or a location, anything that tied him definitively to the cache's retrieval. As she passed a stack of empty fuel canisters, Brandt intercepted her, stepping into her path with unnerving silence. His eyes, the color of cold river water, studied her face, searching for a tremor, a flicker of deceit. "You are the Soviet nurse," Brandt stated. Not a question, his German accent precise and chilling. "Yes, Herr Doctor," she replied, keeping her gaze low, adopting the posture of a fearful, subservient civilian. "You are exceptionally skilled, Schwester Volkova," he continued, the use of her surname cutting through her composure like ice. "It is a shame to waste such talent against the wrong enemy." He paused, his presence suffocating. "Tell me, Volkova, what makes a Soviet woman run to the collapsing enemy lines rather than away?" Section 6. The interrogation and the test of loyalty. Yelena's heart hammered, but her expression remained steady, a carefully manufactured blend of exhaustion and wounded pride. She was no longer just a medic. She was playing a part for an expert interrogator. "Herr Dr. Brandt," she began, using her rank and name to project professional integrity, "the Red Army left us. Major Grigorovich, my commanding physician, ordered the most critical wounded evacuated, and the rest, including the walking wounded and support staff, were told to manage. We had no transport, no provisions. The fighting swallowed our station. I was not running to your lines, sir. I was running from abandonment." She paused, injecting a calculated measure of bitterness into her voice. "I am a medical professional. I serve the wounded, regardless of their uniform. I chose life and service over dying uselessly in a ditch for an army that discarded me. If the Wehrmacht will utilize my skills, I will serve. I have sworn an oath to save lives, not to ideologies." Brandt studied her intently. A muscle twitched in his jaw. This was the exact narrative the NKVD had prepared for her. The disillusioned professional, the victim of Soviet inefficiency. It appealed to the German propaganda line of communist chaos and the superiority of the German system. An interesting philosophy for a Soviet, Brandt finally conceded, a cold smile touching his lips. But loyalty is a slippery thing, Volkova. We will test yours. You are needed immediately for a sensitive task. Come. He didn't wait for her reply, simply turning and walking toward the rear of the command half-track, where Lieutenant Richter was now securing a heavy, steel-banded trunk. The trunk was clearly marked with the Abwehr, German military intelligence, insignia. This, Yelena realized with a jolt, was likely the intelligence cache itself, or at least the container meant to hold it. This trunk contains highly sensitive forward command documentation, Volkova, Brandt explained, gesturing toward the metal box. It must be secured in the medical transport, the safest place, under the pretense of holding irreplaceable medical supplies. You will be its guardian. Lieutenant Richter will now seal it. I need you to confirm the seal's integrity. He was handing her a direct opportunity, but it was also a deadly test. If she showed undue interest in the contents or hesitated, she would be unmasked. Richter produced a spool of lead wire and a small, official brass seal bearing the imprint of a German divisional crest. He threaded the wire through the trunk's heavy clasp and pressed the seal tight with a pair of specialized pliers. Check the seal, nurse, Richter ordered gruffly. Yelena knelt, seemingly focused on the seal's small, intricate crest. As she did so, she was also taking a final, crucial measure of the lock mechanism, the thickness of the steel, and the surrounding environment. Brandt and Richter were standing close, their shadows falling over her. The seal is intact, Lieutenant. Crest is clear, she reported, her voice flat. Brandt, however, was not finished. Good. Now, the final test, Schwester-Volkova. Before we load this, we have a problem. An orderly, Private Schmidt, is suspected of attempting to steal medical supplies. We caught him just now. He is confined inside the ambulance near the fire pit. He claims innocence. We need a medical opinion. You will examine him and tell me if he is lying. Watch his eyes, his pulse. We trust your professional judgment. A good nurse can read more than just wounds. He was forcing her into an act of betrayal against a German soldier. A psychological loyalty test designed to break down her moral boundary and commit her to the German side. If she condemned the man, she would secure her position. If she defended him, she risked exposing her Soviet conscience. I will examine him, Herr Doctor, she agreed instantly, maintaining her professional mask. A rapid pulse and erratic breathing could indeed suggest duplicity, or simply fear of reprisal. I will provide an accurate medical assessment. The ambulance was dark and smelled faintly of disinfectant. Inside, Private Schmidt, a terrified youth, was bound and gagged. As Yelena knelt beside him, checking his restraints, she saw not a thief, but a desperate, starving boy. This was her last window of opportunity. The medical assessment would be her cover for a final, crucial reconnaissance, possibly her last, before the transfer to Mogilev. Section 7. The final break in the monastery rendezvous, Yelena leaned close to Private Schmidt, her face obscuring her movements from the slit in the ambulance door. She used the pretext of checking his gag, swiftly removing the cloth just enough for him to breathe deeply, and whispered in a rapid, nearly inaudible German, "Private, listen. Your only hope is to listen. When I leave, scream. Scream you are innocent. Scream about the pain in your leg, whatever. Cause maximum noise for 2 minutes." Schmidt's terrified eyes widened, but he nodded subtly. He was desperate enough to obey. Yelena pulled a small, sterilized needle from her pocket, a hypodermic she had kept clean, and, instead of injecting him with a sedative, she subtly scratched the back of his hand, deep enough to draw a bead of blood. She reapplied the gag roughly. She exited the ambulance and walked back to Brandt and Richter, her expression grave. "Herr Dr. Brandt," she reported. "The man is under extreme duress. His pulse is 110. He is dehydrated, near shock. But I see a telltale sign of guilt." She pointed to the small scratch she had inflicted. "See? Stress has caused him to self-mutilate in his panic. A classic sign of deep psychological distress related to guilt. He must be dealt with swiftly, but medically, he needs sedation before transport." Brandt looked at the small injury, then back at Yelena, a hint of respect, or perhaps calculated cruelty, in his cold gaze. "Excellent, Volkova. You are a clear-sighted professional. Sedate him, then secure the command trunk in your designated medical transport. We move in 5 minutes." As Yelena returned to the ambulance with a syringe containing a mild sedative, Schmidt began his prearranged performance. He managed to emit a series of choked, thrashing screams before the sedative took effect. The ensuing chaos of soldiers rushing to quiet the guilty man provided the perfect cover. Yelena carried the heavy, steel-banded intelligence trunk, the very thing containing the precious operational maps, and placed it inside the medical transport truck designated for her care. It was the last vehicle in the convoy. A heavy Krupp-Protz ambulance designated for light surgical supplies. She ensured the trunk was secured under a blanket of bandages. The keys to the medical supply truck hung near the driver's seat. The driver, an exhausted elderly corporal named Johann, was outside helping load crates. This was the point of no return. The coordinates were sent. The target, Brandt, was identified. The cash was secured in her vehicle. The Mogilev move was underway. She could not wait any longer. She climbed into the cab. Corporal Johann was momentarily distracted by a Fell gendarmerie officer organizing the column. Yelena quietly locked the passenger door, then swiftly and expertly applied a chokehold to the corporal from behind as he turned back to the vehicle. He collapsed without a sound. Yelena dragged the corporal's body into the back, covering him with a heavy wool blanket. She got back into the driver's seat. She started the engine, the distinctive roar of the Krupp-Protz's engine barely noticeable in the noise of the retreating column. She pulled the ambulance out, joining the end of the column. Instead of turning west onto the main road toward Mogilev, she waited for a momentary gap between the ambulance ahead of her and the Panzer IV protecting the rear. She slammed the wheel hard, taking a sudden, brutal turn onto a narrow, frozen dirt track branching south. The direction of the ruined monastery. The Panzer commander, noticing the deviation, yelled a frantic order. Yelena didn't look back. She pushed the truck to its limits, fishtailing wildly on the treacherous ice and mud, speeding toward the coordinates, toward the waiting Soviet reconnaissance team who were expecting her signal. The pursuit began almost instantly. She heard the terrible, unmistakable whine of the Panzer IV's engine accelerating behind her. The nurse who became a spy was no longer a prisoner, but a desperate fugitive, racing the German military machine across the collapsing Eastern Front, clutching a steel trunk that held the fate of Army Group Center.